So it's now time to walk through part 2 of our discussion of the Handey microservice structure and functionality. This time, we're going to focus on the repository implementation portion, the reactive quote repository, the multi-query repository interface, and then the MultiQueryRepositoryImpl class. And this microservice implementation uses the R2DBC and Project Reactor reactive types in a very fulsome way. So first of all, let's take a look at what we're using as the database. The database we're using here is called R2DBC, which allows programs and programmers to access and interact with relational databases in a reactive and non-blocking manner. And this is widely regarded as being beneficial if you have large client volume with lots of requests, lots of clients, in order to be able to scale the system up effectively. The reactive quote repository itself provides the persistent repository that contains the information about the quote objects using this R2DBC reactive database. R2DBC stands for Reactive Relational Database Connectivity. And then as you can see here, we've got a repository annotation, which just indicates that this repository class provides mechanisms for storage, retrieval, search, update, and delete. These are the so-called CRUD operations, which stands for create, read, update, and delete on objects that are stored persistently. And the way we do this is we extend the reactive CRUD repository interface, which comes as part of Spring. And this provides the interface for generic CRUD operations on a repository for specific types. In this case, we have quotes being the elements that are in the database, and then integer being the IDs. And this follows the reactive paradigm. And as you'll see, it uses the project reactor types built on top of reactive streams. And in particular, it's going to use the flux type. We also implement another interface for our reactive quote repository, which is called MultiQueryRepository. And this interface defines the means to perform multiple queries at once on the quote database. And we're going to take a look at that in just a moment. That's very important because there's certain things you can't specify using the Spring Data API keywords. Speaking of which, we have one method here that we can specify using the Spring Data API keywords, and we call this the find by quote containing ignore case. And what that basically tells Spring, it's a set of keywords that tell Spring to generate a query that will find all the quotes in the database that match the string, that's the query parameter, and to do it in a way where the query just has to be contained within the quote title. And we're going to ignore the case. We're going to ignore whether it's uppercase or lowercase. And you'll notice that this returns a flux of quotes. So that's one of the enhancements we get by using the reactive CRUD repository as opposed to using the JPA repository. Now, sometimes it's useful to know what the actual queries are that are taking place under the hood. And we'll see that when we look a little bit later on when we make our own custom queries. But if you want to find out what the query is that corresponds to this Spring Data API keyword name, you can simply use ChatGPT where you give it the name and the types and so on, and it gives you back what the query looks like or what the query could look like. So in this case, the query will be select anything from the quote table where the lowercase quote field is like the lowercase query parameter that's being passed in. So that's essentially what happens if we were to try to write this directly using SQL. Now let's take a look at the multi-query repository interface in class. And we need this because, as I mentioned before, there's certain things we can't do using the Spring Data API keywords by themselves. So to work around that issue, we're going to define our own interface called the multi-query repository, which allows us to perform multiple queries at once on the quote database. And here are the actual methods we're going to implement. So we're going to define one that's called find all by quote containing ignore case all in, which is a bit of a mouthful. But as you can see, it takes a list of queries, a list of query strings, and it will return all the quotes in the database that have all of the queries. So if they contain all of the queries, then it'll return that, and it comes back as a flux of quotes. Likewise, we have find all by quote containing ignore case any in, which is also a bit of a mouthful, but what it does here is it takes this list of queries and it comes back with a list of quote objects in the database that contain any of the queries, as opposed to what we have here, which is all of the queries. And these methods cannot be generated automatically by Spring and the Spring Data API and the keywords therein. And if you're curious about why that is, I recommend you take a look at ChatGPT. It'll tell you some reasons why it doesn't work. So now that we've defined this interface, let's go ahead and implement the interface. And this is done in a very stylized way, again, a set of conventions in Spring. And to do this, we apply the repository implementation pattern, which is described in the link at the bottom of the slide. And so we have MultiQueryRepositoryImpl, which is the way we name classes that are going to implement an interface in Spring. And in order to make this work, we have to define a private field that's of type database client, which defines a database session that gives us some APIs to perform reactive CRUD operations and to explicitly create queries that will have custom query mechanisms on the database. And then we've got these methods, which I'm not going to talk about at length at the moment. We'll talk about them in just a moment when we look at the implementation. But here's one of them. This is find all by quote containing, ignore case all in. And you can see here we use a build query string helper method to make ourselves an SQL query. And then we call get quote flux, which will execute that SQL query against the quote database and return all the objects in the database that contain all the queries as part of their quote, ignoring case, of course. So that's the end of part 2 of our discussion of the Handey microservice structure and functionality.